While we wait for the slides, pleasant good morning still. Yeah, I'm Donovan Campbell, as Mika said. I'm based in Kingston, Jamaica. I'm a social geographer, a human geographer by training. So we heard yesterday from my colleagues who mainly focus on the biophysical side of things. You heard a lot about coral reefs and mangroves and seagrass beds. My work is focused on the people side of things. I work a lot in coastal communities across the region. I spend a lot of time talking to, common people on the ground, if you may, fisher folks in particular. I spend a lot of time working in small-scale fisheries across the region, trying to understand the different challenges they face, their vulnerabilities, and most importantly, what we can do about it, what some of the solutions are. Okay, so today I will share some insights from some of that work. I will spend a little bit of time talking about well-being and coastal ecosystems. And then I want to share with you 5 entry points for meaningful community-led adaptation that I think would be very useful for this project, and certainly what we are envisioning as we support the implementation of the work. And finally, I will talk about marine protected areas, because we strongly believe that it is one of these tools that can really help to transform communities from an adaptation standpoint. So let's start with well-being. And we know that many coastal communities across the Caribbean rely on the ecosystems that you heard so much about yesterday, the mangroves, the coral reefs, the seagrass beds. And from one standpoint, if we should just look at the provisional service of producing food, they supply important protein. And I'm deliberately focusing on nutrition because we believe that when we are restoring these ecosystems, we're not just doing them because we care about nature and we love nature. We are doing it because they provide important services to society. And when we think about these types of restorations that we are envisioning under this project, we see where these projects can increase a community's access to food. If we're thinking about fisheries, and now everybody is talking about the blue economy. Everybody is talking about blue foods, which are really just your aquatic foods. And even just thinking about the fisheries part of things, we see where over 2.3 billion people have diets that lack at least one micronutrient. And I'm deliberately focusing on this because I want you to step back a little bit from just the physical side of things to think about the human and the social dimensions and why it's very important for us to think about this socio-ecological system that I will talk about a little bit more later. And seafood in particular, we know, plays an important role in addressing some of these micronutrient deficiencies. Now, unfortunately, our Caribbean region has one of the highest non-communicable disease mortality in the Americas. This wasn't the case 30 or 40 years ago. So we're not just heading in the wrong direction environmentally, we're also heading in the wrong direction health-wise. So the main message I want you to get from these first few slides is that human well-being is central to all the successes that we hope to see from our coastal ecosystem restoration efforts. And just in thinking about fisheries alone, we see where it contributes economically over 5 to 6 billion per year in foreign exchange earnings across the region. And that's just economic well-being. Those of us who appreciate well-being in its holistic sense will appreciate that there are spiritual and non-material well-being that we must think about as well when we work in these coastal spaces. And just a little bit of stats for you. Seafood contributes 15% of the region's protein intake. All right? It's very important. It varies as you move from one country to the other. But we also know that the commercial stocks have been overexploited. I'm from Jamaica. Our fisheries collapsed a few decades ago. And we are feeling some of the effects of that. Guadeloupe is not really quite there as yet. But we know that the reefs are threatened by anthropogenic activities. And it is that balancing act between how we progress as a society and how we preserve and protect the environment, thinking about that intergenerational linkages. What are we passing on to the future society? And so there's a high dependence on the coastal zone. Everybody wants to live close to the ocean. I mean, I don't mind people because I love the oceans. But what you find is that there's an increase in concentration and certainly in urban growth along these areas, which puts a lot of pressure on the ecosystems there. So it's important for us when we are thinking about these ecosystems to connect them to society in what we describe as a socio-ecological linkage, which has well-being at its center. So we think about the coastal seascape, but we also think about all of the services, the environmental, economic, social, and cultural services that are provided. And what we will lose, not just monetarily, but also the intangibles, the things that we like to see, the spiritual part of it, our heritage, our inspiration, we can lose some of that. So what we do know, and you can see from the scientific committee team that the project has set up, is that we are dealing with a multidisciplinary problem, a problem that requires multidisciplinary solutions. It's not just the ecology, it's not just the physical aspect, it's not just the social, it's really how we bring everything together that is going to help us to answer the big questions that we want to answer. And from several projects we have implemented across the region, focused on marine protected areas, coral restoration, ecosystem-based adaptation, we have developed what we call a theory of change. And that theory of change, it has as the long-term, if you can see there, the long-term social and ecological and economic impact that communities benefit from more sustainable livelihoods and more resilient coastal ecosystems that support tourism, fisheries, and coastal protection in a changing climate. That's the big vision. That's the goal that we want to, based on all of these project outputs, at the end, when we're looking at the change that we want to see in society, that is the kind of long-term vision or aspiration that we have. And if you work backwards, you will see how these different short-term outcomes, the small things that are being done, if you may, how they can potentially trigger the types of transformational change that we need. And this is what this project seeks to do. And I will say off the bat, this project will not solve all the environmental problems facing the areas targeted. It will not solve all the social problems. But there are some interesting steps being taken And we believe fundamentally that sometimes we try to go too big in terms of the changes we're looking for. Yeah? Sometimes even small pockets of success can trigger transformation, can be an inspiration to people who we didn't even think about when we structured our project deliverables. We weren't even thinking about some of the changes that could come. And so even the capacity building initiatives under the project, the education and awareness, the economic development, these are all in the project to ensure that at the end of the day, there is some potential for the project to be replicated in other territories. And that's why we're here, to share our knowledge from elsewhere, what we have learned, and how it can contribute to the replicability of these activities. But most importantly, it's about developing strategies for sustaining restoration actions. Now, if Guadeloupe is anything like some of the other places in the region, many projects are short in terms of their lifespan. There's a heavy investment, and then once the project ends, that's it, right? I noted in Virginia's talk, she mentioned that one of the strong points of this particular project is that it has the continuity in terms of support and funding. And the leadership of the project is innovative because we don't see these types of projects all the time being led in this way. So we're hopeful that that goal of sustaining restoration actions is possible, but it has to be built on a sensible business model and deep community engagement that aligns with the vision and values of communities we're seeking to transform. And so in terms of how we're thinking about the socio-economic process, it follows a stakeholder participation and communication process, similar to what we've done in other adaptation projects across the region, with the end goal being to influence adaptation planning. And it starts with defining your scope and then understanding the vulnerabilities of the ecosystem, vulnerabilities of the communities, and then looking at specific actions that are necessary to address those issues. If you tackle one and ignore the other, you're basically going backwards. You're not even standing still. There's no progress there. Both have to be tackled simultaneously. And so in a nutshell, we're looking to support the science. We have to embed everything we do with the science. Resources will be needed. Visibility is important. Building connections is important, and we must inspire action at the end. We must inspire some type of behavior change at the end. We are inundated with the impacts of climate change, the risks of climate change. We need to now put on our solution lenses. We need to now start thinking about not so much everything that is going wrong, but what we need to do to address some of these challenges at the local level. And the most important part of that is managing expectations. As I said before, it's very important to scope a project as a project. Yes, it can be transformed into something else, but a project is a start, and there's a lot of learning that happens at the beginning of the project. Okay, so what I want to speak with you about now is a synthesis, if you may, of lessons we've learned from working across the region. And we've come up with these 5, what we think are entry points that we think would be important. And they're very simple. And I'll spend a little bit of time to talk about each. The first one is better recognition of the role of place and space in assessing what motivates and what demotivates communities. We think of communities in a similar way to how my ecologists would think of their reef community or their mangrove community or their seagrass community. They're made up of a diversity of actors. And it's really understanding what their motivations are, what their priorities are, that will help us to align our project objectives effectively. So that's one. Two, identify appropriate, often non-climate focused entry points for communities to engage with adaptation. Unfortunately, climate change adaptation is, in most cases, not at the forefront of people's thinking. They are trying to balance their budgets, they're looking at their bills, they have concerns about other things, and so it's not at the forefront of their minds all the time. What we're saying here is find what these non-climate entry points are and use that to bring in the changes that you hope to see downstream, right? So that's two. Three, building or reforming existing institutions and governance systems, given the introduction. So what we're saying here is building on or reforming existing institutions. Don't try to create new institutions all the time. That can be very expensive. It's a very expensive endeavor. In these spaces that you're trying to work, they already have existing institutions, maybe even existing projects, existing capacities that can be built on, so you don't have to start from scratch. A lot of times, project leaders make the mistake of going into a space and trying to create something from the ground up, losing that platform that has already been built by efforts that predates the implementation of your project. We need to frame adaptation through community well-being and interests of shared values. So we have to find these commonalities. In one particular space, you will find many different actors. And these actors or stakeholders, they have different interests. And I'll touch on it. I'll give an example from Jamaica so you can see what I mean. And we also need to support existing community capacities, recognize where the strengths are in these spaces that you're trying to work, and support those existing. It's importing new capacity is a heavy task. You don't want to do that. You want to find out where the capacities are, and you want to strengthen those in the ways that you think would be useful. So going a little bit deeper in terms of recognizing the role of place and space. We know that steering and managing climate change adaptation, it hinges on values that frames people's interests in local socio-ecological systems. It hinges on values. And unless we understand these values, then we won't be able to synergize our activities with their realities. So we must care about how people feel. We must care about how they think. We must care about their representation of space and what it means to them. I'll give you an example. And Norm, you can look away now, Norm, because we did some work in the southern part of Haiti, Baradere, Korai. And in that community, they were using the mangroves for charcoal. They had depleted the trees on land so much, there was nothing left. And so now, they're using the mangroves for charcoal because there's a huge demand in Port-au-Prince. When I was there, I was puzzled. I was like, and I asked the community leaders, Don't they know the value of the mangroves? Don't they understand that without the mangroves, the fish will go and all of it? And, he said to me, what are we supposed to do? Are we supposed to watch our children die of hunger, not go to school, and leave the mangroves? I didn't really have an answer, but what it made clear to me is that in the battle between environmental preservation and human survival, the environment will always lose. And that is the reality. I'm a realist, and that is what we have been seeing all the time. Appropriate non-climate entry points. People have other things happening within their space. We as scientists, for us, climate change adaptation is the most important thing. We can't understand, we can't move outside of our scientific box and not understand why the whole world isn't rushing to get things done. We don't understand the lack of urgency in many cases. But this is because countries, regions, communities are preoccupied with other priorities. Households are often preoccupied with other priorities. And if we don't understand what those priorities are, we will never be able to create the win-wins that we need for the environment and people's livelihoods. In terms of identifying non-climate entry points, I'll use an example from Jamaica, where they've now established these special fishery conservation areas, and I'll touch on it before my time expires. And these special fishery conservations, they have created a buzz, and they're being led by many community champions. Some of these conservation areas were spearheaded by local community leaders. The communities got up and said, enough is enough. Things are so bad, we must do something about it. And they led the initiative. And building on existing institutions, I think I said enough about that one, so let's skip that. I want to highlight an example from Belize in how important it is to build on existing institutions. Belize still they have a good fishery. When I went there, I felt like, okay, this is what a healthy ecosystem looks like, or at least close to it. And they have a very innovative, what they call managed access, program. And the program itself is good because it builds on these traditional ways of managing the resources, and it's inclusive, meaning they allow still some traditional fishing to happen at certain periods. So it's not a completely closed system, right? And what we believe is that trying to implement anything outside of that can lead to an erosion of traditional values, and it's really trying to balance these existing values that will allow us to achieve the changes we want to see. And adaptation framed through well-being and common concerns. Using an example here, again, in Negril in Jamaica, we've seen where, we still have 7 miles of white sand beach, but it has been significantly eroded, and that has been attributed, Rhea, to the degradation of the coral reefs in that area. And the challenge of bringing it back, it's about reconciling competing values. The artisanal fishers in the area, they have a vested interest in accessing the beach for a different reason. The hoteliers, they want the beach for a different reason. Environmental groups have an interest in the beach for a different reason. And so it's recognizing these diversity of values and perspectives and finding that common thread or signal that we can work with to move forward in terms of protection. And the framing through the socio-ecological lens is very important. Sometimes we see certain things and we don't really pay too much attention. We were in the field one day and, we met a fisherman who had gotten the bends. I don't know. I put the French word there. I hope I got it right. And, in Jamaica, there is only one decompression chamber, and it's at one of our marine labs. And so we were thinking about it. If there's only one decompression chamber, our thesis was that as the ecosystem gets worse, fishers are diving deeper and they're going further at sea. And what we see is a clear signal, if you look at that top graph, is a clear signal of the dive accidents increasing over time. And so if we can make the connection between these risks, what's happening in the environment, these changes we're seeing, and how it impacts directly the health and well-being of individuals, then we're speaking their language. And finally, I want to end with a few points on marine protected areas, because I know you have them here, and I know that it's a very important tool. Frankly, when we think about it, it's one of the most effective tools if implemented correctly, if implemented in a way where communities are not marginalized, where communities are part of the process. And we know that it's a simple logic that if you protect a space and maintain and improve that biodiversity, there will be what is called a spillover effect. And that spillover effect means that fishers who are operating on the outside of the area will also see an increase in catch. And we are seeing some of it in Jamaica under the Special Fishery Conservation Area. And there is a role for, not just engaging communities to participate in the project, but actively as citizen scientists. And there's this one, project that we implemented in Jamaica and St. Vincent and the Grenadines, where they use, for the monitoring, they use fishers. They participated in the data collection and the monitoring, and it helps to create a sense of local ownership. Not just seeing fishers as the problematic group to deal with, but thinking about innovative ways to include them in the scientific process. That is possible, and we've seen it in a few areas. Now, importantly, when we looked at the data, we know the sanctuary or the MPA was working. Because if you look at the blue bars, those represent the traps that were set on the inside. So let me explain. What they had was a live fish monitoring exercise where they had traps in the inside of the protected area and traps on the outside. And they would catch the fish, sedate them, and measure them, and then release them back, right? And at the end of the day, there was clear evidence that across multiple sites, what was happening inside was much better than what was happening outside. So we don't question whether or not it worked. And finally, in these protected areas, these are the best sites for your coral restoration, right? Ria will disagree, probably, I don't know. Right? But anyway, it's protected, right? So, but the Associated Press reported in one of these particular areas that the coral gardeners are bringing back Jamaica's reef piece by piece. And that was inspiring because some of these coral gardeners were trained They were former fishers who got trained to become coral gardeners. They were spear fishers. So they're used to being under the water in the first place. And now they've transitioned their livelihoods and they're being paid to help restore the coral reefs. And the Associated Press made some noise about that. And so that's a positive note I want to end on, that I'm an optimist because there's no point in being otherwise. The challenges we face require solutions. They require optimism. They require positive thinking. But effective engagement of communities is key to every single ecosystem restoration effort that we have. I'll stop there. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. Merci beaucoup.